everyone, and welcome to This Is My Code. I'm Abby from AWS, and I'm here with Kapil from Capital One. Kapil, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into it, can you tell me a little bit about what you do at Capital One and what Capital One does?
Capital One is a leading information-based technology company bringing ingenuity, simplicity, and humanity to banking. And I'm a developer there.
Awesome. So what we're talking about today is some of the ways that Capital One tests their AWS resources. So could you walk me through a couple of the approaches that people could use to testing, and then we'll dig deep in an example?
Sure. So when we're testing against AWS, we're basically testing that external connectivity, an API call to the AWS endpoints. And there's a couple different techniques that are pretty common. One is mocking. So mocking is a pretty generic technique in almost every language library, every language implementation that allows us to basically, instead of making that API call, to inject a response in our test code. And that's a great way of doing things. Some of the issues, though, is that it ends up being a little bit brittle, and it ends up testing our expectations of how the API call actually is going to happen, as opposed to actually testing what the actual real behavior is. So I've definitely seen cases where people mock something, and it works in tests, but not in real. And another technique, which is pretty good and pretty easy to get started with, is something called stubbing. Stubbing is a little bit different than mocking in that instead of having to inject the response that we think is going to happen on every API call, stubbing instead builds up a mental model of how the underlying service works to instead allow us to use the APIs sort of naturally in our tests, and internally it'll figure out how to return the right response. A great stubbing library that I'd like to call out is something called Modo. And Modo is a Python-only library, but really cool is that it offers a REST endpoint, and it covers a wide variety of services. Now, Atlassian and a couple others in the AWS community have created something called Local Stack, which uses Modo and a few other best-of-breed stubs to create a full implementation of over a dozen AWS services. And you can get that basically just by doing Docker run, and you now have everything from API gateway to Route 53 and everything in between. Now, these techniques, stubs are great, except for the fact that they are not necessarily going to be able to give you all of the different functionality of the underlying API. If there's a new feature that comes out, you have to wait for the stub to get updated to reflect that. So you get a bit of a coverage gap, and you get maybe a bit of a capability gap to the actual thing. So as a result, one of the ways that I like to test is using something called flight recording. And so a great library for that is Placebo. Right? So let's go into some unit tests using Placebo as a flight recorder. This is the Cloud Custodians unit test. Cloud Custodian is an open source project from Capital One. It is used for fleet management at scale across all the AWS resources for security, compliance, cost optimization, lots of cool stuff. So we have over 700 unit tests with Custodian that use this sort of Placebo flight recording technique. And you can see here that effectively all we're really doing is we're setting up how we get our session, our SDK session, a little bit differently. Here we've got it doing replay. If we wanted to, we could switch this out to record, and it'll actually go to the live AWS API endpoints, and we make API calls and restore all the responses onto disk. So then we go into replay mode when we're running our test, and it'll actually be offline, won't make any real API calls. It'll just replay all the stuff that was on disk. So here, after we've set up our Placebo session, all we do is we interact with the API effectively and normally. So here we're creating a VPC, we're deleting it after the test is done, we're describing network ACLs and doing a couple of API calls, and then finally we get our test assertion and we're done. One of the nice things is that you have a bit of flexibility in how you set up with flight recording. You can go in and manually create some stuff in the console or using a different tool and then test against that in your unit test. Or you can do something where this unit test is self-contained. Like in this unit test, we're actually creating a whole VPC. We're creating all this stuff. And so that actually ends up being really powerful because, at least for us, what we do is that we set up this little functional decorator in our test. When we say that a test is fully self-contained, we're now able to take this thing that we're using as a unit test, and then actually, as we go to make a release, for example, we'll actually record it, run it live against a live environment because we know that it's completely self-contained. So that ends up being a really powerful way to test using flight recording to get full coverage on all the AWS APIs and to test actual behavior.
So it sounds like for those of us that are maybe just getting started with testing out our infrastructure instead of just our code is a couple of things to think about, right? So always use the right tool for the job. So one way it might be easier to trap an error, and some ways you keep up with the latest resources and services. But there's a tool out there for everything. And then treat your infrastructure the same way as you treat your application code. So test often and test thoroughly. Kapil, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure. And thanks for watching. This is my code.